Welcome to Strip Cover Lit, where we squeeze the bigger picture out of literature. I'm Adrian Fort, and we are here for another poetry discussion. A poetry discussion which will take place in three separate playlists here on the channel. Number one, obviously, being the poetry discussion playlist. Number two, being a playlist of poems by Rainer Maria Rilke. And number three, I think it is worth going through this. This is going to be the first of the Sonnets to Orpheus by Rilke. So maybe a new series we will have. We will go sonnet by sonnet through this series, throwing down some thoughts on these poems as well. The poem itself reads as such, and this is translated by Robert Temple. Found a bunch of different translations of this. I thought that this one was maybe the most readily understandable. If you guys have thoughts on what translations to use here, let me know in the comments section. But I just went with one that I thought was sort of middle of the line as far as, do you translate the art of the poem? Do you translate the words? I don't know exactly, right? So I just went with this one. So let me know if there's anything that would be better to do. There the tree rises, O pure surpassing. O Orpheus sings, O great tree of sound. And all is silent, and from this silence arise new beginnings, intimations, changings. From the stillness animals throng, out of the clear, snapping forest of lair and nest, and thus they are stealthy, not from cunning, not from fear, but to hear, and in their hearts the howling, the cry, the stag call seem too little, and where before was but the rudest shelter to receive these, a refuge fashioned out of darkest longing, entered tremulo, the doorpost a quiver. There you have fashioned them a temple for their hearing. So a couple things that I think are maybe necessary to... So tremulo. I am not familiar with this conjugation. I assume that it is like the tremolo here, which is a music term, I believe, that means basically tremors in the sound, a tremulous sound. So I assume that's what that is. Orpheus. These are, after all, letters to or sonnets, pardon me, to Orpheus. Orpheus, in Greek mythology, Orpheus was a Thracian bard, legendary musician, and prophet. He was also a renowned poet, and, according to the legend, traveled with Jason and the Argonauts in search of the Golden Fleece, and even descended into the underworld of Hades to recover his lost wife, Eurydice. Um, so this is basically just ripped right from the opening paragraph of the Wikipedia article on Orpheus. Not everything about the character, but a little bit of knowledge. But also, in my understanding, trees were often used to represent Dionysus. Now, if you want crazy discussion about Dionysus, you can search out what Nietzsche had to say about Dionysus. But Dionysus, in ancient Greek religion and myth, Dionysus is the god of winemaking, orchards, and fruit, vegetation, fertility, festivity, insanity, ritual madness, religious ecstasy, and theater. He was a busy guy. He was also known as Bacchus by the Greeks, a name later adopted by the Romans for a frenzy he is said to induce called Bacchia. Bacchia. As Dionysus Eleutherius, the liberator, his wine, music, and ecstatic dance free his followers from self-conscious fear and care, and subvert the oppressive restraints of the powerful. His thyrsus A fennel stem scepter, sometimes wound with ivy and dripping with honey, is both a beneficent wand and a weapon used to destroy those who oppose his cult and the freedoms he represents. Uh, we always have to destroy those who oppose our freedoms. Those who partake in those who partake of his mysteries are believed to become possessed and empowered by the god himself. Now, insanity, ritual madness, these types of things paired with prophecy, poetry. We have maybe, I hate to bring some business talk into this, but synergies here between these two myths, if you are willing to look deep enough, if you are willing to allow a little bit of grace. Now, I think one thing that is interesting to note here is how often stories of creation or religious overtones start with a tree. What is a tree? Why start with a tree? Well, I think part of this is that a tree is the largest domesticated portion of nature, right? We do not grow mountains, we do not plant oceans, but we can sure domesticate trees. And I think in that way, what a tree sort of comes to represent on some level is a little bit of individuality, right? So there's the phrase, can't see the forest for the trees, right? The forest is made of the trees. The trees, therefore, are the individuals. The individual inherent to the group is one of the things that we have kind of built into Western culture. The idea of the tree, the idea of an individual tree is bigger than the idea of the forest. That's not exactly what that phrase means, but we understand it in that way, seeing the forest for the trees. Can't see the forest through the trees, however it is that you want to diagnose that phrase. Individuality there again becomes prevalent, becomes prominent, becomes part of this poem. And if we look there at the first stanza, there the tree rises. The tree is the individual. O pure surpassing, O Orpheus sings. Orpheus, the poet. O great tree of sound, and all is silent. And from this silence arise new beginnings, intimations, changings. So the interesting thing to me about this first stanza here is we're talking about the tree. I believe that the individual, right? The individual is planted in this poem. Dionysus becomes, when we talk about removing the self-conscious fear and care, Dionysus becomes very important to the individual. The individual is only self-conscious and has fear of standing out when they are not comfortable or confident in the individual that they are. So the wine, the music, the ecstatic dance removes the fear of self. So when we're up here in this, we have the madness and the creativity represented by Dionysus and Orpheus. That is, and then we have the all talked about here. We have the tree, we have nature, the madness, the chaos of nature sort of funnels into a song of creation, which leads to change. And kind of the rest of the poem is everything being in awe of that change, of that flow of things, of the fact that the individual, the tree, the Dionysian elements, the individual can recognize the chaos of nature, can tame it into something understandable, poetry, just as an example, poetry, and the individual can use poetry in order to change. I think, in my opinion, that is in very large part what we're talking about here. Um, Surprisingly, I'm new to Rilke. Okay, I have heard the name for 15 years. Never really dived into his poetry. Never really dove into his poetry. I am coming around to this poetry now, and one of the interesting things that stands out to me as someone who holds Emily Dickinson so dear is that people, when they talk about Rilke, seem to talk about Rilke the same way that I talk about Emily Dickinson, sort of with awe, sort of with revere, as opposed to the way I talk about Charles Bukowski, another one of my favorite poets. I don't talk about him in that way. I really believe in the utility of poetry, that these are tools by which we might become better human beings. And I can really use Bukowski sort of as a shovel, whereas Emily Dickinson, and maybe this is something that I have to learn not to do, Emily Dickinson's a little more hands off to me. Emily Dickinson is a little more of a precision tool in my estimation. That seems to be the way that people talk about Rilke. And still, when I went looking for, so a lot of times what I'll try to do is understand the sort of academic approach to some of this stuff before I come to you guys with it. And I try to always say, look, the general consensus on this poem is X, Y, and Z. I'm sure it's out there. I couldn't find it for Rilke. I have no sources for Rilke, which is confusing because when I say no sources for it, I mean general internet. There are people on YouTube who absolutely love Rilke. I can't find sources for individual works. Everyone sort of takes the canon approach to Rilke, at least that I could find, including academic lectures, which never, the ones I watched two or three, okay, and I probably clicked around on 5 to 7. Haven't heard the name of a single work. You hear him talked about in the same way that Nietzsche is talked about as well. Like, people who approach him from a literary standpoint sort of seem to put him on this pedestal. People who approach him from the philosophical standpoint sort of put him on par with Nietzsche or any of those types of philosophers, which is really rare in my experience for a poet. I can't think of another poet that I have seen get the academic attention that I have seen Rilke receive, at least through the medium of YouTube, but none of this academic attention is literary. Like, all the people from a literary standpoint that I can find talking about Rilke are and I don't mean this as a dispersion, but are non-academic in their approach, which, hey, that's great. That's how I try to take Bukowski, right? That's how I try to take several authors in my life. But the academics that I can find on Rilke are almost exclusively talking about him in a philosophical sense, as opposed to a literary sense. And I wonder if there's something to do with translation for that. But anyway, that's what I have for this, the first sonnet to Orpheus. If you like or appreciate what I do here, hitting the like button really does help me out, as it tells YouTube to share this video with other literature lovers. And if you find yourself here by chance but not design, consider hitting the subscribe button, because literature is the only thing I do on this channel. There is poetry every Monday, and I hope to have you back for the next one.